The crystalline spires of Zentari Station gleamed like frozen lightning against the backdrop of space, their surfaces reflecting the light of three distant suns. Within its corridors, beings from across the galaxy mingled in what was considered the most prestigious educational institution in known space, a place where the elite offspring of 100 worlds came to learn, to grow, and to establish the connections that would shape the future of galactic civilization. It was a place of wonder, of opportunity, of infinite possibility. It was also a place where humans were absolutely forbidden. The Galactic Educational Consortium had been clear on this matter for over 2 centuries. Earth, designated as classification Omega-7, a death world of the highest danger rating, produced beings too violent, too unpredictable, too fundamentally dangerous to be allowed among civilized species. The very idea of a human setting foot on Zentari Station was considered not just impossible, but unthinkable, which made the presence of Sarah Chen all the more remarkable. She moved through the station's corridors with the careful precision of someone who understood that discovery meant death. Her appearance had been carefully crafted through months of preparation, synthetic skin that gave her the pale blue tint of an Altarian, contact lenses that shifted her brown eyes to the silvery hue common among the vegan colonies, and a carefully programmed universal translator that would mask any linguistic tells that might give away her true origin. To any casual observer, she appeared to be exactly what her forged documents claimed, a minor nobility student from the Altair system, quiet, studious, and utterly unremarkable. The irony was not lost on her that she had to make herself appear weak to hide her strength. Sarah had spent 18 years on Earth knowing she was different, knowing she was stronger and faster and more resilient than the baseline humans around her. But those same qualities that made her exceptional among her own species made her a monster in the eyes of the galaxy. Earth's high gravity, toxic atmosphere, aggressive flora and fauna, and extreme weather patterns had forged humanity into something that terrified every other sentient species in known space. Humans were classified alongside the Krillian death wasps and the void spawn of the Magellan cluster, things to be contained, avoided, and never, under any circumstances, allowed to spread. But Sarah Chen had never been one to accept limitations imposed by others. She had discovered the truth about humanity's reputation purely by accident. A crashed survey probe in the Australian outback, its data cores intact and its alien technology surprisingly accessible to her enhanced cognitive abilities. What she found in those records changed everything she thought she knew about humanity's place in the universe. They weren't alone. They never had been. They had simply been deemed too dangerous to join the galactic community. The discovery had consumed her. She spent months learning everything she could about galactic civilization, about the species that comprised it, about their fears and their prejudices. She learned about Zentari Station, about the opportunities it represented, about the future leaders who walked its halls, and she began to plan. The plan had taken 3 years to execute. False identities, forged documents, careful cultivation of a background story that would stand up to scrutiny. She had learned 17 galactic languages, studied the cultural nuances of 43 different species, and trained herself to move and speak and think like someone who had never known the crushing weight of Earth's gravity or the constant struggle for survival that defined life on humanity's harsh homeworld. Most importantly, she had learned to hide her strength. It was perhaps the cruelest irony of her situation. On Earth, she was considered gifted but not exceptional. Her reflexes were quick, her mind sharp, her physical capabilities impressive, but within the range of human normal. Here, surrounded by beings whose homeworlds were gentle gardens compared to Earth's violent ecosystem, those same capabilities made her a weapon of mass destruction disguised as a teenage girl. The first few weeks on Zentari Station had been a careful exercise in restraint. She had to relearn how to move, how to interact with objects designed for beings with a fraction of her strength. A casual handshake could crush delicate bone structures. A moment of surprise could send her jumping clear across a corridor in view of dozens of witnesses. Even her metabolism worked against her. She had to carefully regulate her food intake to avoid appearing to have the massive caloric requirements that Earth's harsh environment had bred into humanity. But it was working. 3 months into her carefully constructed charade, she had managed to blend into the background of station life. Her grades were good but not exceptional. Her social interactions pleasant but unmemorable. She attended lectures on galactic history, participated in cultural exchange programs, and slowly, carefully, began to understand the complex web of prejudices and assumptions that kept her species locked away from the stars. It was during a routine xenobiology lecture that she first encountered Kethtar Voss. Kethtar was everything that represented the worst aspects of galactic civilization. Born to a prominent family from Proxima Prime, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced genuine hardship. His species, the Proximans, were among the most influential in the galactic consortium. Their homeworld a paradise of controlled climate and carefully managed ecosystems. They were tall, elegant beings with naturally graceful movements and an inherent sense of superiority that came from millennia of being at the top of the galactic food chain. The lecture hall was discussing the various classification systems used to categorize worlds and their indigenous life forms. Professor Zelantic, an elderly Centaurian with a passion for taxonomic precision, was explaining the reasoning behind the various danger classifications when the subject of Deathworlds came up. Classification Omega ratings are reserved for worlds so hostile to life that any species evolving there must, by necessity, develop traits that make them incompatible with civilized society, the professor explained, his forearms gesturing at the holographic display showing various world types. Take Earth, for example, classification Omega-7. The gravitational forces alone would crush most of you instantly, but the species that evolved there, these humans, they're essentially walking weapon systems. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to show only the mild academic interest that her assumed identity would display. But inside, her jaw clenched as she listened to her entire species being dismissed as monsters. Kethar raised one elegant hand. Professor, surely you're being somewhat dramatic. I mean, how dangerous could one primitive species really be? Professor Zeltic's main eyes widened in what Sarah had learned was an expression of alarm among his species. My dear Kethar, you clearly haven't studied the Terran incident reports. During first contact, a single human child, a juvenile, mind you, accidentally killed 3 trained galactic survey officers simply by enthusiastically greeting them. The gravitational differences meant that what the human considered a gentle pat on the back delivered enough force to shatter their skeletal structures. The lecture hall erupted in nervous chittering and gasps of horror. Sarah felt her hands clench involuntarily and had to consciously force them to relax. But that was an accident, protested Velara, an Andromedan student known for her idealistic viewpoints, surely with proper precautions. An accident that demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility, Kethtar interrupted smoothly. These creatures are simply too dangerous to exist alongside civilized beings. The consortium was absolutely right to quarantine their entire world. Can you imagine if even one of them managed to get loose? The damage they could do. Sarah felt something cold and hard settling in her chest. These beings, these supposedly enlightened representatives of galactic civilization, were discussing her people like a plague to be contained. The casual dismissal, the assumption of superiority, the complete inability to see beyond their own prejudices, it crystallized everything that was wrong with their perfect, sanitized society. I heard rumors, Kethtar continued, warming to his subject now that he had the attention of the lecture hall, that there were actually proposals to sterilize their entire world, clean slate, use it for mining operations. Honestly, it might have been the merciful option. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Sterilize Earth, genocide, dressed up in the language of mercy and practical resource management. She felt her vision narrow, felt the careful control she had maintained for months beginning to crack at the edges. Professor Zeltic was saying something about diplomatic considerations and the value of maintaining buffer zones, but Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering her little sister's laugh, her parents' faces, the view from her apartment window overlooking Sydney Harbour. She was thinking about 8 billion people going about their daily lives, completely unaware that somewhere among the stars, beings like Kethtar were casually discussing their extermination as a matter of academic policy. Her hand moved before she could stop it. The writing stylus she had been holding crumpled like paper in her grip, the sound of stressed metal clearly audible in the sudden silence that followed. Every being in the lecture hall turned to stare at her, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she had just revealed herself as possessing far more strength than any Alterarian should possess. Professor Zeltic's 4 eyes focused on her with unmistakable alarm. Miss? Chen, wasn't it? Are you quite all right? That stylus shouldn't have been possible to. I'm sorry, Sarah said quickly, her mind racing as she tried to salvage the situation. I've been taking enhancement supplements. Sometimes I forget to compensate for the increased grip strength. It was a reasonable explanation, Enhancement drugs were common among students trying to improve their physical capabilities for various sporting competitions, but she could see the doubt in several sets of eyes, could sense the questions beginning to form. Kethar was looking at her with something approaching interest now, his earlier casual dismissal replaced by a predatory focus that made her skin crawl. How interesting. I didn't realize Altairians were into that sort of thing. The way he said it suggested he knew exactly how unusual it would be for someone from her supposed homeworld to be using such substances. Altairians were known for their natural physical grace. They had no need for artificial enhancement. Sarah forced herself to smile, to project the slightly embarrassed demeanor of someone caught in a minor deception. Well, when you're competing against species with natural physical advantages, sometimes you need a little help to keep up. It was a mistake. She realized it the moment the words left her mouth. The smile that spread across Kefthar's features was predatory and knowing. He had caught her in an inconsistency, and he was clearly the type of being who enjoyed using such discoveries to his advantage. How refreshingly honest, he said, his tone carrying undertones that made several nearby students shift uncomfortably. You know, I've always believed that true character is revealed when beings are under pressure. It's so interesting to meet someone willing to admit to enhancement. The way he emphasized the last word made it clear that he suspected there was more to her story than illegal performance drugs. Sarah felt the net closing around her and knew that she had to end this conversation quickly before his suspicions could crystallize into something actionable. If you'll excuse me, she said, standing carefully and making sure to move with the fluid grace expected of an Altarian, I need to speak with my academic advisor about my course load. She gathered her materials with deliberate calm, hyper-aware of every eye tracking her movements. As she reached the lecture hall exit, she heard Kefthar's voice carry clearly across the room. Of course. But Miss Chen? I do hope we'll have the opportunity to continue this conversation soon. I have such a fascination with unusual individuals. Sarah walked through the station corridors with her heart hammering against her ribs, every instinct screaming that she had been made, that her carefully constructed identity was beginning to unravel. But it was worse than simple discovery. Kefthar's interest suggested that he suspected something specific, something that went beyond mere academic dishonesty. She made her way back to her quarters through routes that she had memorized during her first week on the station, taking care to vary her path and check for surveillance. Her room was small but comfortable, designed for a single occupant and equipped with the basic amenities expected by a minor nobility student. Most importantly, it was private and shielded against electronic surveillance, a precaution that all students were afforded as a matter of basic privacy rights. Once safely inside, Sarah allowed herself to slump against the closed door and really feel the magnitude of what had just happened. 3 months of careful planning, of meticulous attention to detail, potentially undone by a moment of emotional weakness. She had trained herself to control her reactions, to present the perfect facade of someone who belonged in this sterile paradise, and she had let a bigot's casual genocide fantasies get under her skin. But as she replayed the conversation in her mind, she found that her regret was limited to the tactical error, not the emotion that had caused it. Kethar and beings like him represented everything that was wrong with the galactic order. They lived in their perfect world, surrounded by their perfect societies, and casually discussed the extermination of entire species as a matter of policy. They had never faced hardship, never struggled for survival, never been forced to become more than they were just to see another day. They were weak. The thought crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. For all their technological advancement, for all their cultural sophistication, for all their supposed moral superiority, beings like Keftar were fundamentally weak. They had never been tested, never been forced to overcome impossible odds, never learned that true strength came not from comfortable circumstances but from the willingness to face and overcome adversity. Earth had forged humanity in fire and hardship. Every human alive was a survivor, a descendant of beings who had clawed their way up from the primordial ooze of a world that actively tried to kill them every single day. They had faced ice ages and volcanic winters, plague and predation, starvation and violence, and not merely survived but thrived. They had turned their world's attempts to destroy them into the very qualities that made them strong. And now those qualities, that strength born of adversity, were seen as something to be feared and contained rather than celebrated and embraced. Sarah made a decision that would change not just her own fate, but the trajectory of human galactic relations for generations to come. She was done hiding. She was done pretending to be weak to make others comfortable. She was done allowing prejudice and fear to dictate what she could and could not achieve. If beings like Kethar wanted to see a dangerous human, she would show them exactly what they had been missing. Part 2, The Unraveling. The days following the incident in the xenobiology lecture were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though Sarah doubted Kethar thought of it in such terms. He was more like a predator playing with wounded prey, applying pressure at carefully calculated intervals to see how his target would react. The problem was that his understanding of predator-prey dynamics had been shaped by a lifetime on gentle worlds among civilized species. He had no frame of reference for what it meant to corner something that had been forged by the most dangerous planet in known space. Keftar's first move came during the weekly social gathering that all students were encouraged to attend. These events were held in the station's grand atrium, a massive space with transparent aluminum walls that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding nebula. Students from dozens of worlds mingled in small groups, engaging in the sort of networking that would serve them well in their future careers as diplomats, administrators, and leaders. Sarah had initially avoided these gatherings, but her academic advisor had gently suggested that isolation was not conducive to the sort of cultural exchange that Senthary Station was designed to promote. So she attended, nursing a carefully chosen beverage that wouldn't interact poorly with her human biochemistry, and engaging in a sort of polite, meaningless conversation that seemed to comprise the majority of galactic diplomacy. She was in the middle of a discussion about trade route optimization with a group of economics students when she felt a familiar presence behind her. The conversation continued around her, but she could sense Keftar's approach with the sort of prey sense that humans had developed over millennia of being hunted by things larger and more dangerous than themselves. "Miss Chen!" His voice was smooth and cultured, carrying just enough warmth to seem friendly to any casual observer. "How delightful to see you here." "I was hoping we might continue our earlier conversation." Sarah turned to face him with a carefully neutral expression, noting the way the other students in their little circle subtly shifted to accommodate his presence. Kethar commanded attention wherever he went, a natural charisma that came from absolute confidence in his own superiority. He was flanked by two other students, Zarath from the vegan colonies and Morden from Arcturus, both of whom looked distinctly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge whatever game their more influential companion was playing. "Of course," Sarah replied, keeping her voice pleasant and even. "What did you want to discuss?" "Your enhancement regimen," Kethar said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I've been doing some research and I find myself quite curious about the specific compounds you're using. You see, I have something of a background in biochemistry, and I'm always fascinated by the various ways different species attempt to improve their natural capabilities. It was a trap, and not a particularly subtle one." Sarah could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was watching for any sign of deception or discomfort. He had clearly spent time researching enhancement drugs and their effects, probably specifically as they related to Altarian physiology. Any lie she told now would need to be precise enough to fool someone who had done his homework. "I'm afraid the details are rather boring," she said with a slight laugh. "Mostly standard metabolic enhancers and neural conductivity boosters. Nothing particularly innovative." "Ah, but that's where it gets interesting," Keftar pressed, his smile never wavering. "You see, I consulted with Dr. Yelanara in the medical center about the specific effects of such compounds on Altairian physiology. According to her research, the metabolic enhancers you're describing would actually have a detrimental effect on someone from your homeworld. Something about the way they interact with your species' natural cellular structures." Sarah felt the trap closing, but kept her expression pleasant and slightly confused. "That's odd. My physician back home assured me that the compounds were perfectly safe for Altairian use. Perhaps there are different variants being used in different systems?" It was a reasonable response, the sort of innocent confusion that could explain the discrepancy. But she could see that Keftar wasn't buying it. His smile had taken on a sharp edge, and his companions were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Perhaps," he agreed, but his tone suggested anything but acceptance. "Or perhaps there's been some sort of misunderstanding about your actual physiological requirements." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that she had reached a decision point. She could continue to try to maintain her cover, spinning increasingly elaborate lies in an attempt to preserve her false identity. Or she could take the initiative and turn the confrontation to her advantage. "You know," she said thoughtfully, You seem awfully interested in my personal medical information. I'm curious, is this the sort of attention you pay to all students who catch your notice? Or am I special somehow? It was a deflection, but also a subtle counterattack. By questioning his motives, she was forcing him to either back down or escalate in front of witnesses. Either choice would tell her something useful about his intentions. Kethar's smile widened, and Sarah realized that she had just given him exactly the opening he wanted. Oh, you're definitely special, Miss Chen. In fact, I'd say you're quite unique among our little student body here. The way he emphasized unique made it clear that he had moved beyond suspicion into something approaching certainty. Sarah felt her options narrowing rapidly, but also felt a familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the transition from hunter to hunted. Every predator-prey relationship eventually reached a point where the roles could reverse, and she was beginning to sense that moment approaching. How flattering, she replied with just a hint of ice in her voice. Though I have to say, your definition of conversation seems to involve quite a bit of interrogation. Interrogation? Kethar looked genuinely surprised, though Sarah suspected it was an act for the benefit of their increasingly uncomfortable audience. I'm simply trying to get to know a fellow student better. After all, we're all here to learn from each other, aren't we? To share our cultures, our experiences, our unique perspectives on galactic civilization. There was something in the way he said unique perspectives that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It suggested that his suspicions had crystallized into something specific, something that went beyond mere academic dishonesty or illegal enhancement drugs. He suspected her true nature, and he was playing with her the way a cat might play with a mouse. The problem was that he had fundamentally misunderstood which of them was the predator. Well then, Sarah said with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes, perhaps you'd like to share some of your own unique perspectives? I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on species classification systems, for instance. You seemed quite passionate about that subject during our xenobiology lecture. It was her turn to apply pressure, to see how he reacted when the conversation turned to his own prejudices and assumptions. She watched with satisfaction as his confident expression flickered slightly, clearly not having expected her to go on the offensive. Classification systems are simply practical necessities, he said after a brief pause. The galaxy is a dangerous place, and civilized species need to be able to identify and contain potential threats. It's not personal, it's simply a matter of survival. Survival, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. Interesting choice of words. Tell me, Kethar, what do you know about survival? Have you ever actually faced a genuine threat to your existence? Or are you speaking purely from theoretical knowledge? The question hit home. Sarah could see it in the way his posture shifted slightly, the way his companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. Beings from paradise worlds rarely had to confront the reality that their comfortable existence was built on the systematic exclusion of anything that might challenge their sense of security. I don't see how personal experience is relevant to policy discussions, he said, but there was a defensive edge to his voice now. The consortium's classification system is based on scientific analysis and statistical modeling, not emotional reactions. Scientific analysis, Sarah mused. Based on what data? How many members of these supposedly dangerous species had the consortium actually studied? How many have they given the opportunity to prove that they can coexist peacefully with galactic civilization? She was walking a dangerous line now, coming perilously close to revealing her own investment in the topic. But she was also tired of playing defense, tired of listening to beings who had never faced real hardship make pronouncements about species they had never bothered to understand. Kethar's eyes narrowed slightly, and Sarah realized that she had just confirmed something he had been suspecting. You seem remarkably well informed about consortium policy regarding dangerous species. I don't recall that being covered in any of our coursework. I believe in staying informed about galactic affairs, she replied smoothly, especially policies that affect billions of sentient beings. Don't you think it's important to understand the reasoning behind such momentous decisions? Oh, I understand the reasoning perfectly, Kethar said, and now his voice carried an unmistakable note of triumph. The question is, why do you care so much about the fate of species that pose a clear and present danger to galactic stability? Sarah felt the moment crystallizing around them. She could see the calculation in his eyes, could sense that he was building towards some sort of revelation or accusation that would shatter her carefully constructed identity once and for all. The smart thing to do would be to find an excuse to leave, to retreat and regroup and hope that she could maintain her cover long enough to complete her mission. But as she looked at his smug, superior expression, As she thought about his casual discussion of genocide and his absolute certainty in the righteousness of exclusion and containment, Sarah realized that she was done being smart. She was done hiding her strength to make others comfortable. She was done allowing fear and prejudice to go unchallenged. "You want to know why I care?" she asked. And for the first time since arriving on Zenthori Station, she let her real emotions show through her carefully constructed facade. "Because I've spent my entire life listening to people make pronouncements about things they don't understand. I've watched as fear and ignorance get dressed up as policy and science. And I've seen how easy it is for beings who have never faced real hardship to condemn those who have." The small group that had gathered around them was silent now, clearly sensing that they were witnessing something significant but unsure what exactly was happening. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, could sense their growing discomfort with the intensity of the conversation. Keftar, however, looked absolutely delighted. "How passionate you are about abstract principles of justice," he said. But his tone suggested that he thought there was nothing abstract about her passion at all. "One might almost think you had a personal stake in the matter." Sarah met his gaze directly, and for a moment let him see exactly what lay behind her carefully constructed mask. "You've spent 2 centuries classifying humans as too dangerous to interact with. But how much do you actually know about us? How many humans have you studied? How many have you given the opportunity to prove that we can coexist peacefully with galactic civilization?" Commander Felrus finally stopped reaching for his communication device, though he remained poised to trigger emergency protocols. The initial contact reports were quite clear: multiple casualties, extreme violence, incompatible behavioral patterns. "The initial contact reports," Sarah interrupted, "describe a species that had just experienced first contact with alien life forms, had no context for galactic civilization, and was responding to what they perceived as an invasion. You're basing 2 centuries of policy on the reactions of beings who thought they were being attacked by monsters from space." She leaned forward slightly, noting how all 3 of her interrogators instinctively recoiled despite themselves. The movement was as natural to her as breathing, but to them it represented a shift from passive to potentially aggressive posturing. "Let me ask you something," she continued. "What do you know about human history? About how we developed, how we survived, how we built our civilization?" "Constant warfare," Kefthar said immediately. "Environmental devastation, resource competition, systematic violence, all the hallmarks of a species too dangerous for civilized contact." Sarah smiled. And this time she let them see the predator behind her eyes, not as a threat, but as an illustration of the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped galactic policy for 2 centuries. "You see violence and warfare and assume that makes us monsters," she said. "But you're missing the context. Earth tried to kill us every single day. Ice ages that lasted millennia. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for decades. Predators that were specifically evolved to hunt and kill anything that showed weakness. We didn't become violent because we're monsters. We became strong because anything less meant extinction." Dr. Yelnara was taking notes now, her scientific mind clearly engaged despite the potential danger of the situation. "So you're suggesting that what we interpret as pathological aggression is actually adaptive behavior shaped by environmental pressures?" "I'm suggesting," Sarah said carefully, "that you've been looking at the wrong data. Yes, humans are capable of extreme violence, but we're also capable of extreme cooperation, extreme self-sacrifice, extreme innovation in the face of impossible odds. We've survived things that would have wiped out any other species in the galaxy, and we've done it not by becoming monsters, but by becoming more than we thought possible." She stood up slowly, noting how all 3 of them tensed as she rose to her full height. Even without obvious threat postures, her mere presence was enough to trigger every survival instinct they possessed. "You want to know what makes humans truly dangerous?" she asked. "It's not our strength, or our speed, or our ability to survive in environments that would kill you instantly. It's our refusal to accept that limitations imposed by others define what we can achieve. Every human alive is the descendant of beings who looked at impossible odds and decided to overcome them anyway." She gestured around the security office, taking in the advanced technology, the sophisticated systems, the comfortable environment that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. "All of this," she said, "was built by species that evolved in gentle environments, that never had to face real adversity, that never had to become more than they were just to see another day. You've created something beautiful, something peaceful, something that represents the best of what sapient life can achieve. But you've also created something fragile.
Commander Thelris was finally beginning to understand where she was leading the conversation.
You're suggesting that our lack of adversity makes us weak? I'm suggesting, Sarah said, that strength isn't just about physical capability.
It's about the willingness to face hardship, to overcome obstacles, to become more than you thought possible. And I'm suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy needs beings who have learned those lessons. She moved toward the transparent aluminum wall that offered a view of the station's exterior, where the gentle glow of distant stars painted patterns across the nebula beyond. Her movement was fluid and controlled, but all three of her observers could sense the coiled power in her frame, the potential for explosive action that characterized predators from Deathworlds. "Look around you," she said. "Zenthri Station, the Galactic Consortium, all the peaceful worlds where you come from. It's all beautiful, all perfect, all exactly what sapient civilization should aspire to become. But it's also completely defenseless against anything that doesn't follow your rules, anything that doesn't share your assumptions about how the universe should work." She turned back to face them, and now her expression was serious, almost grim. "You've spent 2 centuries hiding from humans because you thought we were too dangerous to interact with. But the real danger isn't that we might hurt you. It's that you've made yourselves incapable of surviving in a universe that doesn't care about your comfort or your assumptions about how things should work." Dr. Yelnara looked up from her notes, her sensor organs focused on Sarah with obvious fascination. "You're talking about more than just physical resilience, aren't you? You're talking about psychological and social adaptations. I'm talking about the difference between beings who have been tested and beings who haven't," Sarah said. "Every human has faced adversity that would break most other species. We've learned that when the universe pushes back, you push harder. We've learned that when the odds are impossible, you find a way anyway. We've learned that the only thing that can truly destroy you is accepting that you're already beaten." She paused, letting the implications of her words sink in. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," she said quietly. "That's not just a human saying. It's a human reality. Every one of us has faced moments where we had to choose between giving up and becoming more than we thought possible, and every one of us chose to become more." Kefar was staring at her with an expression that had shifted from fear to something approaching awe. "You're saying that adversity made you stronger." "I'm saying that adversity made us human," Sarah replied. "And I'm saying that maybe the galaxy needs to understand the difference between strength that comes from comfort and strength that comes from surviving the impossible." Commander Thelris had abandoned any pretense of triggering emergency protocols. Instead, he was listening with the sort of attention that suggested his worldview was undergoing fundamental reconstruction. "What are you proposing?" he asked. Sarah smiled, and this time it was the expression of someone who had finally reached the moment she had been working toward for 3 years. "I'm proposing that it's time for the galaxy to grow up," she said. "I'm proposing that instead of hiding from species that challenge your assumptions, you learn from them. I'm proposing that instead of building walls to keep out anything dangerous, you become strong enough that danger doesn't matter anymore." She gestured toward the communication console that Commander Thelris had been reaching for earlier. "You can trigger your emergency protocols if you want. You can have me arrested, detained, shipped back to Earth in a containment cell. You can maintain the status quo and keep pretending that exclusion is the same thing as safety." She paused, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "Or you can make a different choice. You can decide that maybe it's time to find out what happens when beings who have never been tested work alongside beings who have survived the ultimate test. You can discover what the galaxy might become if it stopped being afraid of its own potential." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of possibilities that had never been considered before. Sarah could see the calculation in their eyes, the recognition that she represented something unprecedented. A human who had proven that coexistence was possible, who had demonstrated that strength didn't have to mean destruction. Finally, Dr. Yelinara spoke. "The scientific implications alone are staggering. If humans can adapt to our civilization without losing their essential nature, if they can contribute rather than simply survive, the political implications are even more significant," Commander Thelris added slowly. "If the consortium's fundamental assumptions about Deathworld species are incorrect, if containment policies are based on flawed data," Keftar was the last to speak, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "I've spent my entire life believing that strength came from superiority, from being better than others. But you're talking about strength that comes from being tested, from overcoming impossible odds." He paused, studying her with new eyes. I think I've been wrong about what makes someone truly dangerous. Sarah nodded, recognizing the moment when fear transformed into understanding. The most dangerous beings in the universe, she said, are those who have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. But the most powerful beings are those who have faced their own weaknesses and chosen to overcome them. She moved back to the chair she had been sitting in, but remained standing, a gesture that was both respectful and confident. So, what happens now? She asked. Do we continue the policies of the past, or do we choose to build something new? Commander Thelrus looked at his colleagues, then back at Sarah. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would echo through history. Dr. Yolanara, please postpone any emergency notifications. I think we need to have a much longer conversation about galactic policy and the assumptions it's based on. He paused, then added, Miss Chen, I believe you've just initiated the most significant diplomatic revolution in consortium history. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of 3 years of planning and preparation finally paying off. Commander, I think that's exactly what the galaxy needs. The question is whether you're ready for what comes next. Outside the transparent aluminum walls, the stars continued their eternal dance, but for the first time in 2 centuries, the future they illuminated held possibilities that no one had dared to imagine. The revolution had begun not with violence or conquest, but with a simple truth, that strength born of adversity was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Sarah Chen had proven that principle, not by hiding her nature, but by transcending it. And in doing so, she had opened a door that would change the destiny of both humanity and the galaxy forever. The age of hiding was over. The age of becoming had begun. The pretense of weakness, the careful restraint, the constant vigilance required to appear harmless, all of it had been exhausting in ways she hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. Now, with the mask beginning to slip, she could feel her real self emerging from beneath the carefully constructed facade. And her real self was tired of being afraid. Part 3. The Revolution. The summons came at dawn, station time, delivered by a security drone that materialized outside Sarah's quarters with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that turned even arrest warrants into polite requests for cooperation. The message was brief and formal. Report to Security Division 7 for questioning regarding academic credentials and student identity verification. Failure to comply would result in immediate detention and deportation proceedings. Sarah stared at the holographic notice hovering in front of her door and felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The waiting was over. The careful dance of deception and counter-deception had reached its inevitable conclusion, and now she could finally stop pretending to be something she was not. She took her time preparing for what was almost certainly her final appearance as an Altarian student. The synthetic skin modifications came off easily enough. They had been designed for temporary use anyway. The contact lenses that had hidden her human eye color went down the waste disposal along with the hormone regulators that had been masking her true biochemical signatures. For the first time in months, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw Sarah Chen, human being, rather than the carefully crafted illusion she had been living. The transformation was startling. Without the artificial modifications, her true nature was immediately apparent to anyone with even basic xenobiological training. The bone structure, the muscle density, the way she moved, everything about her screamed predator from a high-gravity Deathworld. It was honestly surprising that her disguise had lasted as long as it had. Security Division 7 was located in the station's administrative core, a section that most students never had reason to visit. Sarah made her way through corridors lined with polished metal and soft lighting, past offices where the real work of maintaining galactic civilization was conducted far from the public eye. Her footsteps echoed differently now that she wasn't carefully modulating her gait to match Altarian movement patterns, each step carrying the unconscious confidence of someone who had been born to survive in an environment that actively tried to kill everything in it. The security office was spacious and professionally appointed, designed to be intimidating without being overtly threatening. 3 beings waited for her. Commander Thelrus from Station Security, Dr. Yelnara from the Medical Division, and Kefthar Voss looking extremely pleased with himself. Miss Chen, Commander Thelrus began, consulting a datapad with his primary manipulator arms while his secondary arms remained folded in a gesture of formal authority. Thank you for coming. We have some questions about inconsistencies in your academic records. I'm sure you do, Sarah replied, making no effort to maintain her Altairian accent or mannerisms, though I suspect the inconsistencies go somewhat beyond academic fraud. Dr. Yelnara leaned forward, her sensor organs focusing on Sarah with obvious fascination. Extraordinary. Your biochemical signatures are completely different from yesterday's readings. The metabolic rate, cellular density, neural conductivity, it's as if you're an entirely different species. That's because I am, Sarah said simply. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm human. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. Commander Felrus's secondary arms unfolded in an involuntary defensive posture, while Dr. Yelenara's sensor organs dilated in what Sarah recognized as an expression of scientific fascination overriding survival instincts. Only Kethar seemed unsurprised, though even he couldn't quite hide his mixture of vindication and terror at having his suspicions confirmed. Impossible, Commander Thelrus said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Humans are contained on Earth. No human has left their home system in over 2 centuries. Yet here I am, Sarah pointed out reasonably, standing in your security office, having spent 3 months as a student on your prestigious station. I attended lectures, participated in cultural exchanges, and got decent grades in xenobiology. I even made friends. Well, sort of. She gestured toward Kethar, who was looking distinctly less pleased with himself now that he was face to face with an actual representative of the species he had so casually dismissed as monsters. Dr. Yelnara was running a portable scanner over Sarah, its results painting holographic displays in the air between them. Bone density approximately 3 times galactic standard. Muscle fiber composition consistent with high-gravity world adaptation. Neural pathway efficiency suggesting enhanced reflexes and cognitive processing. Estimated physical capabilities. She paused, recalculating. Commander, this individual could literally tear apart the structure of this room with her bare hands. I could, Sarah agreed conversationally, but I haven't, have I? I've been here for 3 months, surrounded by beings who would be considered physically fragile by human standards. And the worst thing I've done is crush a writing stylus when someone suggested that my entire species should be sterilized for the good of the galaxy. Commander Thelrus was reaching for his communication device, no doubt to alert station security to the presence of what their classification system defined as an extreme biological threat. Sarah watched his movements with the sort of casual attention that a human might pay to a butterfly landing on a flower. Commander, she said gently, before you trigger whatever emergency protocols are spinning through your head right now, might I suggest that we talk about this rationally? Rationally? Kethar found his voice at last, though it was pitched higher than his usual cultured tones. You're a human. Your presence here is a violation of every safety protocol in galactic law. You could kill everyone on this station without breaking a sweat. I could, Sarah agreed again. But, again, I haven't. I've spent 3 months being very careful not to hurt anyone, not to reveal my capabilities, not to do any of the things your classification system says I should be compulsively driven to do. Doesn't that suggest that maybe your assumptions about my species are flawed, Doctor? Yelenara was still staring at her scanner readings with the sort of fascination that made Sarah slightly nervous. The physiological adaptations are remarkable. Every system optimized for survival in an environment that would be instantly lethal to any other known species. The redundant organ systems alone represent evolutionary innovations that we could study for centuries. Which brings up an interesting point, Sarah said, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under her Deathworld-adapted bone density. Let him glimpse the strength that had been forged in the fires of Earth's harsh crucible. The resolve that came from knowing that survival required becoming more than you thought possible. Maybe I do, she said quietly. Maybe I think it's time for the galaxy to face some uncomfortable truths about who the real monsters are. The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Sarah could see the moment when Keftar's suspicions crystallized into certainty, could watch as his expression shifted from predatory amusement to something approaching alarm. He had been playing with what he thought was a mouse, only to discover that he had cornered a tiger. Well, he said after a long moment, his voice carefully controlled. How? Illuminating! I think perhaps this conversation has gone far enough. For one evening, it turned to go, but paused and looked back at her with an expression that was equal parts fascination and fear. Miss Chen, I do hope you'll be careful. Zenthary Station can be a dangerous place for those who don't quite fit in. D. It was a threat, politely phrased but unmistakable in its intent. Sarah smiled at him, and this time she made no effort to hide the predator behind her eyes. "Thank you for the warning," she said sweetly, "though I should mention that I've always been quite good at taking care of myself." As Kethar and his companions disappeared into the crowd, Sarah realized that her time of hiding was over. He would investigate, would probe deeper into her background, would eventually uncover the truth about her identity. She had perhaps days, maybe hours, before her carefully constructed cover story collapsed entirely. But for the first time since arriving on Zenthary Station, she felt truly alive.